I think they absolutely should be held accountable for their advice. And I think economists should also be held accountable for what kind of economics we're using. There are a number of different types of economic models, economic theories out there. And when we, as an economics kind of discipline, there is this idea that there's just one, the Washington consensus, for instance, when it comes to my field of development economics. It's been, recently people have been talking about the Beijing consensus, but that's also equally quite hard to define too. But I think when I was, for example, studying development economics, we were taught that there were at least 6 different paradigms of development economics. There was, the capitalist model of development. There was a structuralist model of development, the neo-Marxist model of development, the Mao model of development. There are 6 at least. And when we, at the same time, when we read papers on development economics or look at policies coming out from some of the largest multilateral institutions, whether that's IMF, World Bank, but even the UN, which I worked for a while, we don't ask, or we should be asking at least, and this is the accountability question, we should be asking, well, what model of development economics are you using? And have you set out what the possible pathways might be if you used a different model? Because there is no one model to development. There's non-linearity. The idea that, I actually think one of the least useful concepts in economics is equilibrium. Because, and we often, and many economists, and we're trained to do this, is to use models, general equilibrium models, for forecasting the economy. And what we end up doing is trying to set out a number of parameters, mathematical parameters, through which we think the society is going to move and the economy is going to move. But the fact is, our economy, and we, even rationally, we move in very different directions. The economy is dynamic. There's a lot of unpredictability, and there's complexity. There's some brilliant books out there all about non-linearity, complexity. Eric Beinhock is one of my favorite authors on that. Why are we not consistently referring to these different types of economics when we use them? I think we actually have to be much more explicit going forwards, so that people understand what kind of framework we're in a sense either being confined to, or we're opening ourselves up to. I think, and I do also think that's why it is in some ways helpful to think about different economies and how they've evolved. I mentioned Washington consensus and Beijing consensus. Now, while certain people will assign Beijing consensus to kind of socialist theory and to communism, there are a number of aspects of China's development which can also be very useful and interesting to think through and link to other types of models of development which are not necessarily associated with governance or democracy, or lack of democracy, which is what some people tend to think of when you say Beijing consensus. They think that's really about governance, but it's not. There are also aspects of the economics. If you're looking at African economies, when a government is thinking about how to deal with the agricultural sector, different economic frameworks will give you different answers. One economic framework will say, well, focus on the smallholder farmers, try and meet their basic needs, give them cash. That's a basic needs approach to development. Another model will say, we need to provide fertilizer subsidies. and at a massive scale. And we need to even subsidize fertilizer, not just through subsidizing fertilizer itself, but through subsidizing transport of fertilizer and a whole range of aspects of the economy. That's a Chinese Maoist type approach. And yet another model will say we need to have the private sector, big business. Let's get all the smallholder farmers away from the small farms, make them bigger, agribusiness, bring processing. That's a completely different model as well of economics and economic development. So we need to be explicit. These are different choices. And I think part of the challenge in particular in many of the organizations that work on development and have, an economic department, several economists being part of it, is we're not explicit about those choices. And when we write things like business cases, which say, what's the impact going to be of this particular program, or what's how is it going to help people? We don't say, well, there's all these different types of options for helping people, and we're choosing one particular way. There tends to be a kind of a group think around these things, and it's important to get out of that.